Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this magnificent room of the University of Ljubljana, and welcome to the Odoteca workshop on the value and role of smells in museum practice. We will hear more about the Odoteca project towards the end of this event. And we have the pleasure of having 5 speakers today, 2 of which are very well known to the olfactory museum practitioners and curators, and the rest of us are researchers within the Odoteca project. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. This is Dr. Lizzie Marks, and she joins us from University of Cambridge, Department of History of Art, and she will be talking about olfactory exhibitions. Lizzie Marks completed the History of Art BA at King's College in Cambridge in 2014, while her doctoral research is dedicated to challenging the prevailing desensitized art historical narrative of the 17th century by investigating the visual representations of the perfumed and the fetid and exploring what meanings they held in Dutch society. As part of Ode Europa, this is a big European project also researching historical olfactory narratives. Lizzie works on identification and analysis of the visual traces of smell in artworks and on the incorporation of the olfactory in museum exhibitions. Over to you, Lizzie.
Well, thank you so much, Mattia, and to all of the wonderful team at Odoteca for the kind invitation to speak with all of you today. And I will just go back. There we go. I've really admired the work that Odoteca has been developing and the benefits that it will bring to collections care and interpretation. So I'll be intently following the results of the work as it comes out. Now, Odoteca is complementary to the work that I've been undertaking over the last few years. I'm a specialist in early modern art, where my PhD proposed a new approach to exploring art through the lens of smell. And my thesis was titled Visualizing, Perceiving, and Interpreting Smell in 17th Century Dutch Art. It considered how smell was expressed in art, how the depicted sense might have been experienced, and what sorts of meanings they held. The way in which I first got into the topic was from the fundamental question of how can something invisible be rendered visible? Smell, this invisible substance that hangs in the air, which can have such an influence over us, must surely be represented in works of art. And I found that invisible smells are translated into image through depictions of scented objects, such as muffs, gloves, and scented jewellery, which are known as pomanders, and fumes diffused from chimneys, tobacco pipes, and incense burners all illustrate a steady diffusion of smell. Smell is also alluded to through the reactions to it. Pinched noses or even fleeing figures, as well as congregating flies, suggest repellent smells, while noses positioned towards a smell source suggest the presence of scent. They all articulate visualizations of smell in art. And once you start looking, there's an entire olfactory world to be discovered. And by olfactory, I mean relating to the sense of smell. If smell could be identified in works of art, I wanted to know what sorts of interpretations could be gleaned from them. How can they play a part in the narrative? Take, for instance, tobacco. In this still life, all of the various smoking requisites are on display. It includes tobacco boxes to store tobacco and sulfur splints to ignite it, and an oil lamp with a thin wisp of smoke coming off it, which has its own particular scent. Tobacco imported from Brazil was a relatively novel drug to the Dutch Republic. It was only commercially available at the turn of the 17th century, and so this still life from 1628 is displaying a stimulant that took Dutch society by storm. Depictions of tobacco illustrate the material culture built up around smoking in the 17th century. However, there are varying meanings that can be gathered from depictions of tobacco and its scent. It is hard to miss that the objects are assembled before a skull, a symbol of death. The scent of tobacco in the still life was therefore associated with transience. By putting it at the center of the still life, tobacco can be regarded as a memento mori. Tobacco will go up in smoke, and so too will the viewer of the still life. It is illustrative of the sorts of associations that tobacco had in the 1620s. This painting is an example of the ways in which scents are endowed with meaning in works of art. After identifying the presence of smells, it becomes clear that they actually have a significance. Scents develop narratives and suggest how an artwork can be understood. Researching smells in art actually goes to the core of what it means to read and comprehend the art of the past. In my doctoral research, I discovered that the viewing experience was in fact multisensory. Flower still lifes are the genre that typically come to mind when thinking about smell in art. And the multitude of flowers that were depicted in 17th century paintings evoke varying bouquets of fragrance. In the Dutch Republic, the polymath Constantine Hawkins was an avid amateur perfumer, among many other things, and he was quite taken by the works of the flower painter Daniel Segers. And in a poem from 1645, he writes about a competition between Mother Nature's roses and the roses painted by Segers. According to Hawkins, the artist wins because he is able to create the scent of flowers out of oil paint. So when Hawkins looked at Segers' painting, he was able to see the flowers, but also imagine their smell. Looking at this beautiful painting on copper by Segers and Jan Kossiers, you can see what Hawkins means. Segers painted all of the flowers, including a branch of orange blossom undulating over the top of the stone, and 2 bouquets of vibrant tulips, carnations, and other blooms arranged below. And the roses that Hawkins praised are among them. At the center of the painting, Kossiers paints a stone bust portraying none other than Hawkins himself. And this painting was in fact a gift from the artist to their admirer, Constantine Hawkins. While his verse was ultimately meant to praise the artist, it offers some insight into the mode of viewing at the time. Viewers noticed the odorous things that were painted, and through their imagination, they were able to experience the scents. Hawkins' poem actually belongs to an entire corpus of texts that describe how the olfactory was mobilized through the viewing experience. And this should be taken into account when thinking about the art of the past. There are a number of works of art that refer to the olfactory, and the texts from the past suggest that they were not only meant to be enjoyed for their visual qualities, but for their olfactory qualities too. If this was the case in the past, is it not time to refocus our attention on depicted scents in artworks and to imagine their odors? Would it not be a more accurate way of interpreting and experiencing the art? Well, once you start looking at works of art in this manner, it has an impact on the way in which you experience it. An exercise in thinking about the presence of the olfactory in art had quite a remarkable influence on me when I trialed this mode of viewing. It was most profoundly felt when I stood before Cornelis Bisschop's scene of a kitchen interior. This is from the Dordrecht Museum. A woman attentively stirs a sauce on hot coals, and a boy fuels the fire with puffed up cheeks, and you can actually see the sparks dancing from the pot. The table is laden with sliced fish, pie, and oranges, and another fish is cooking in the hearth. In the middle ground, figures busy themselves with cooking, washing up, and setting the table for the feast. As I looked at the scene, I started to imagine the smells filling the space. and it was not long before I began to hear the sounds from the kitchen, the knocking of the wooden spoon against the earthenware pot, the hurried footsteps of the figures making their way to the dining room, and the clattering of dishes that the man is washing in the background. I could even begin to feel the heat radiating from the hearth. When displayed in the right way and with the right interpretive content, it is possible to get closer to looking at art in a way that someone in the early modern period once did, in a multi-sensory way. What I find so special about this approach is, in understanding art, is just how accessible it is for a vast range of people. As most of us are able to smell, it is a topic that has the potential to interest many audiences, and it promises to enhance their experiences with art and heritage at large. Little did I know that even before I completed my PhD, I was able to share my research through an exhibition and working on the Horizon 2020 Ode Europa project. And in today's presentation, I would like to explore how research into olfactory history can be transformed into olfactory exhibitions and heritage projects and the compelling stories that they can tell. I'd like to focus on two case studies of initiatives that I've been involved in. The first being the summer 2021 exhibition Fleeting Sense in Colour at the Mauritshuis in The Hague. And it was an exhibition that drew together a range of 17th century Dutch and Flemish paintings, drawings, prints, and objects that were all related to smell. In addition to the works of art on display, 6 pieces were paired with a corresponding scent, so as to develop the understanding or interpretation of the work. The second case study was developed as part of the Horizon 2020 Ode Europa project. And by way of briefly summarizing, Ode Europa uses AI technologies to source images and texts related to smell to research Europe's olfactory history. One of the outcomes of the research is the development of heritage initiatives. And this includes workshops for heritage professionals, an encyclopedia of olfactory history and heritage, and olfactory guided tours, including one currently taking place in Museum Ulm. Der Nase nach, or Follow Your Nose in English, takes visitors around Museum Ulm, its permanent collection, through the sense of smell. And the tour threads together artworks across several centuries, from 1480 to 1965, and that creates a new route to explore the chronologically ordered galleries. The artworks come from a range of places across Europe, and they use different media that span from oil paintings to found objects. We launched the tours this April, and they will continue for at least a year. By exploring these two case studies, I shall discuss the methodologies involved in researching the heritage objects to uncover their olfactory histories. I will also discuss the different approaches that were taken to develop the corresponding sense. I will be speaking from my field of expertise, specifically in the history of Northern European art, but I really want to emphasize that these approaches can work with heritage objects across time and place. And the examples that I will discuss just skim the surface of the potential of exploring the olfactory in heritage collections. And I also want to emphasize from the outset that both projects were team efforts. So I came on board with my knowledge of olfactory art history, and the colleagues who I worked with contributed their special expertise to develop the projects. So at the Mauritshuis exhibition, I worked with the museum's curator, Ariane van Zuchtelen, who brought to the project her deep knowledge of the collection. Knowledge of implementing olfactory heritage initiatives came from the olfactory art historian and curator Karel Verbeek. And the scents were developed by perfumers at IFF, standing for International Flavors and Fragrances. And they are experts in developing scents ranging from laundry detergents to luxury perfumes. Bernardo Fleming at IFF coordinated the scents development. And the design of the delivery mechanisms were created by Studio Lauter. For the olfactory tour of Museum Ulm, the Ode-Europa team and I worked with the curator Eva Leistenschneider and the museum's director Stephanie Date, both experts of the collection. The tours and the methods of diffusion were managed by Sophia Erich at Ode-Europa, and the creation of the scents were once again coordinated by Bernardo Fleming at IFF. So this gives you some insight into the teamwork that is required to undertake these projects. They are an amalgamation of diverse expertise, which, through the collaborative efforts, is able to achieve something quite unique. Collaborations entail gathering knowledge of one another's field. And for me, this meant getting acquainted with scent delivery mechanisms. There are many different mechanisms that can diffuse a smell in a heritage context, and choosing the right one is dependent on the different needs of the project. Of all the diffusion methods, perhaps wet diffusion will be the most familiar to everyone. This is where an essential oil is mixed with ethanol and loaded onto card, known as a blotter, and we'll get to have an experience of that in a while. And it's the same approach as sampling fragrances in a department store, for instance. Wet diffusions are especially effective in retaining those fugitive top notes of a smell. However, from a conservation perspective, using wet diffusion methods come with some risk, as it's not advisable to have any liquids near a heritage object. So preparing the blotters in advance solves this issue. For the Mauritshuis exhibition, a dry diffusion method was used. The essence of the scent was stored in the flask, which is hidden underneath the platform on display. And through the foot pump on the floor, air is pushed into the flask, and molecules from the fragrance are pushed out of the pipe and diffused from the funnel where visitors can sniff. And the foot pump was, of course, more sanitary than using a hand pump, and the scents could be smelled remarkably well while using a face mask. Other technologies include wispies, which are devices where the fragrance is deployed through a hand-powered air pump, and this option is being used at Museum Ulm. Spraying hand fans with scent is another diffusion method. Every movement of the fragrance fan directs scented air towards the participants, and here the scents diffuse as quickly as they arrive. And one further dry diffusion method is scratch and sniff. And readers of the Mauritshuis exhibition catalogue had a souvenir of the show through a scratch and sniff scented bookmark. And I've got the catalogue here for anyone who would be interested to look through it afterwards. And also at the end of August, Ode-Europa will be launching a smell tour of Amsterdam, where visitors can learn about the city's eco-history by being guided to various stops through an app. And there are particular scents to sample too, which are printed on a scratch and sniff card. Choosing the right diffusion mechanism depends on different needs. Some are fixed to a spot and others are portable. Some mechanisms give the user more autonomy with engaging with the scent, while other mechanisms are controlled by a guide. The mechanisms vary in the time in which the scents linger, and the scent's intensity can vary too. These are all decisions that are taken into consideration as the project is under development. In the next section, I will cover the different approaches we used at the Mauritshuis and Museum Ulm through several different categories. They are history paintings, painted details, historic spaces, fantasy scents, rescenting the material, and historic recipes. And one further methodology that I won't be discussing concerns headspace technology, and it's a method to capture the scents emitted from artifacts, and then by analyzing the scents, it's possible to create a remarkably complex olfactory profile. And this is the research that, of course, Ode-Taka is involved with, and also Dr. Cecilia Bembibre, and she will be discussing this in more detail in her presentation. But onwards to history paintings. Biblical texts and legends are rich in olfactory descriptions and hold stories where smells play a part in the narrative. In history paintings, artists translate the texts into visual representations which can allude to the olfactory. It's possible to work with the textual sources that refer to smell and source corresponding imagery. For instance, it was recounted in the Bible that when the Christ child was born, 3 kings arrived from the east to worship him. They came with precious gifts. This included gold, and the 2 other gifts presented to the Christ child were frankincense and myrrh, both of which are gum resins that are valued for their perfume. The tradition usually follows that Caspar, the eldest of the Magi, offers gold. Melchior, the middle magus, brings frankincense from Arabia, and Balthazar brings myrrh from Africa or Yemen. And whilst frankincense symbolizes Christ's divinity, the bitter smell of myrrh is representative of Christ's humanity. In this painting of the Adoration of the Magi from around 1480 in Museum Ulm's collection, Caspar kneels to present Christ with gold. The frankincense from Melchior is stored in the shapely golden receptacle, and myrrh from Balthazar is kept in the horn-shaped vessel. Some people are familiar with the smell of frankincense, as it's used still today in Catholic Mass. Myrrh, on the other hand, is less familiar. At Museum Ulm, visitors could sample both of the scents, and by giving visitors the opportunity to smell the 2 resins, the fragrances that were gifted to the Christ in the story of the Nativity were brought to life. Outside of history paintings, olfactory narratives can be expressed through the visual language of smell in art. This wonderfully detailed painting by Willem van Mieris shows a grocer's shop, where the grocer is weighing out ingredients into a bag, and a boy is taking one of the biscuits from the tin. They are surrounded by sacks, barrels, and baskets of different dried ingredients. In the containers lining the shelves, there are boxes that are labeled with mace, nutmeg, and cloves. So if you have a look on the bottom shelf on the far right, you can see it reads nootmus, which is short in Dutch for nootmuskaat, meaning nutmeg. If you look on the shelf above that, you can see it says foelie, and that is in Dutch mace. And if you go all the way to the back on the lower shelf, you might just be able to see what says nagel, which is short for kruidnagel, which is cloves in Dutch. And at the turn of the 17th century, cloves, mace, and nutmeg from the Moluccas in eastern Indonesia were imported as part of the Dutch East India Company's trade. And it led the Republic to become a force in global commerce. More than a century later, this painting illustrates how the spices are established ingredients at the grocer's shop. The inspiration for a fragrance was evidenced within the painting itself. And by using details from the painting, a fragrance that consisted of cloves, mace, and nutmeg was created for the Mauritshuis's exhibition. It evoked the smell of the grocers, and it embodied the history of the Republic's ambitious trade campaign. Displaying a fragrance that is emblematic of trade and prosperity brings up issues on the sensitivities of working with smell. The sweetness of the grocer's scent inadvertently gives a positive association to the sense of commerce. However, this is somewhat deceiving, as the pleasure that the spices brought to the Republic was at the expense of the many people who were impacted in the Dutch East India Company's wake. We made it our responsibility to explain in the accompanying interpretive text that the Republic's prosperity was gained through exploitation, slavery, and abuses of power in the places from which the spices came. And by drawing out this context, the sweetness of the scent was therefore experienced critically. These are the sorts of issues that need to be considered when thinking about the scents that are appropriate to develop, and then how they should be explained and experienced. There are certain bygone atmospheres, or smellscapes as they are known, that are particularly interesting to study because of how vastly different they are in comparison to today. Take Jan van der Heijden's canal scene, which meticulously documents life in Amsterdam. Workers transfer barrels between the canal and the waterside, an infant is entertained by a child and a dog, and 3 figures glide along the canal by rowboat. The scents of the Amsterdam canals can also be identified. Beside the bridge, the Mauritshuis's exhibition curator Ariane van Zuchtelen noticed a wooden structure which was used as a privy, where the refuse was emptied directly into the canal. And yet, a woman to the left is using the canal to do her laundry. Animal entrails, fish guts, rotting vegetables, and industrial waste from the leather tanneries and textile producers all ended up in the water. And in the warmer and more humid months between May and October, so peak time right now, the foul waste created a stench that was said to be almost insufferable. Many plans were developed to purify the canals, but it was not until 1872, with the construction of a steam-powered pumping station, that the dirty water was flushed out to sea. And here, visitors to the Marwat's house were able to use the foot pumps, at their discretion, of course, to experience the scent of a stagnant canal. And the scent was displayed next to another fragrance which evoked the smell of freshly laundered clothes. It was inspired by a painting of a linen closet in an urban household. And the transition from fresh laundry to stagnant water created an even starker contrast between the fragrant and the foul within the city. The scent of the canals in the 17th century were probably comparable to rotten eggs, the molecules of which come from sulfur. And for paintings and works on paper, sulfur is perfectly safe. However, when sulfur molecules come into contact with silver, it has a harmful reaction. It creates silver sulfide, which blackens the silver and tarnishes it. And a few feet from the Van der Heide painting were cases displaying silver objects. Sulfur is one of a small number of volatile organic compounds that cannot constitute a heritage scent. It was decided from the outset of the scent's development that the sulfur component of the canal's composition must be excluded. But I can reassure you that the resulting scent was able to evoke the foul, stagnant water very efficiently. Working with scents also presents the opportunity to explore the historical imagination. And this almost life-size depiction of Christ in Limbo is on display in Museum Ulm. Before his resurrection, Christ descended to Limbo to redeem the condemned souls of the righteous. The Ulm artist Martin Schaffner paints Christ reaching out to figures who clamber out of the opening of Limbo's fortress. A demonic creature spits fire at Christ, and thick grey fumes seep out of the fortress's walls, which suggests that the smell of hell is smoky. In early modern thought, the smell of hell and evil was associated with the foul. The Catholic theologian St. Ignatius of Loyola encouraged worshippers to reflect on hell using all of their senses. To him, it smelled of smoke, brimstone, again that sulfurous smell, corruption and rottenness. And the scent created by IFF was an evocation of hell inspired by how the historical imagination once perceived it. Concocting such a foul scent made us reflect on the use of malodors in the museum space, so foul smells. Should pleasant smells be exclusively used in heritage initiatives? How strong should the scents be before they provoke a negative reaction? Given that we have different tolerances and sensitivities to smell, where should that threshold lie? This does not only apply to foul scents. The very personal connection to scents means that they can trigger powerful memories. It's therefore important to trial run the scents before they're launched to gauge how the scents might impact diverse audiences. And once launched, participants should be prepared for the scents that they will experience. It needs to be clearly communicated just how the scents might have an effect on them. Since perfumers are usually trained in creating pleasant scents, it actually took some time to develop a scent that was foul enough to truly call it hellish. The resulting scent has smoky notes in reference to the smoke seeping from the fortress's walls. The rottenness of hell was created by using the compounds of indole, which is the scent of decay that you find in lilies sometimes, and scatol, which is a fecal scent. And sniffing the scent before the painting gives us a glimpse into the Christian imagination from several centuries ago. Rescenting the material is the closest methodology to Odoteca, as it focuses on the materiality of heritage objects and the sense that they possess. Perhaps the most potent example comes from Museum Ulm's collection in a work by Dieter Roth titled Kleine Landschaft, or Little Landscape in English. In the mid-1960s, Roth experimented with using food as a medium in his art practice. Wedged between the frame's mounting and glass pane is a composition of processed cheese on sandpaper wrapped in plastic. And I wonder if this work is reminiscent to anyone of a piece that I discussed earlier. Does anyone have a thought? All right, I'm getting shakings of head. Well, to me, the fleeting fumes of tobacco in the painting and the scent of decaying cheese in Roth's work share a common message, albeit 3 centuries apart. Roth's work can be read as an updated still life. By presenting decomposing food, Roth creates a live-action memento mori. The cheese decays, and he suggests that one day we shall do the same. Now, the trouble is that the smell that presumably once lingered in Roth's Kleine Landschaft has disappeared, as it has completed its process of rot. The aim was therefore to once again endow the work with the scent that would have emanated from it when it was on display some 60 years ago. That is to say, we wanted to reunite the work with the smell of rotting cheese. And the resulting scent that IFF developed really didn't disappoint. For me, it's closest to how I would imagine the smell of hell to be. If Roth's message was not clear beforehand, being confronted with the stench of decay made the meaning of his work undisputable. The final approach I'd like to discuss concerns recipes. And there's rich source material from recipe books, household manuals, and medical treatises which are still available to us, which means that it's possible to follow historic practices that can lead to developing a scent with relative accuracy. And this portrait was used in the olfactory tour of Ulm, and it depicts Eitel Bessere, a resident of Ulm who came from a patrician family. And he wears a sumptuous fur hood, and hanging from his rosary is a silver filigree pendant known as a pomander. And the pomander's hollow compartments hold fragrances, which were believed to protect the wearer. And in the early modern period, foul smells were believed to be harmful to the body, while pleasant smells were thought to be protective, especially during plague outbreaks. Pomanders were thus smelled as a precautionary measure against disease. Some pomanders, such as this, contained a prepared aromatic ball where all of the fragrances are combined and bound in gum or wax and then stored in the openwork pendant. And now I'd like to invite the in-person participants to smell the version of the pomander that we developed. And I'd love to hear, please just shout out your first impressions from the smell. I'm seeing smiles in satisfaction, so I'm glad it smells pleasant. From this side of the room, any first impressions? Or does it remind you of anything, maybe? Museums? Okay, so that's really interesting. It's reminiscent of a museum.
It's a very medicinal smell to me.
Excellent. Okay, so Matthias says it has a very medicinal smell, which I think is a sort of accurate association. As I was saying before, it was meant to be a sort of a preventative scent from the plague. Mint and cinnamon. How about this side of the room? Any impressions? Wonderful. So one participant has said that it reminds her of her grandmother, which often these sort of older smells can evoke that sensation, especially if they're quite complex fragrances. And how about on this side of the room? Yes, like Vicks Vapor Rub, maybe. Yeah. Any more thoughts? All right. Well, I'll please keep on enjoying the smell while I describe how the fragrance was made. So this fragrance is based on a pomander that designated the fragrance by the engraved name on each segment. And the segments are labeled rosemary, schlag, which is this prepared aromatic mixture, cloves, rose, lavender, and lemon. And this configuration was typical of early modern Northern Europe and suggests that some of the ingredients that might have been included in the pomander displayed in the portrait. And by combining the ingredients together, the perfumers at IFF were able to produce a fragrance that evoked the sorts of scents that the sitter in the painting was likely to smell. And even though we had full access to the ingredients that constituted a pomander, it raised the question, to what extent could the recreation be historically accurate? While nutmeg and lemon are both labeled on the pomander, the perfumers decided that they would not include it in the final formula. They did include an additional ingredient of oregano, which maybe you'll be able to smell. I found it quite potent. And that sort of enriches the scent. And animal rights campaigning has also sanctioned the use of musk, which comes from a musk deer, civet, which is from civet cats, and ambergris from sperm whales. But this is in the formula for the historic pomander. So they must rely instead on synthetic ingredients, such as civetone, which is used within this formula. And it means that the modern simulation of the pomander actually contains further simulations of the animalic scents. The pomander has been transformed into a contemporary interpretation. It's gone through a process of translation and transmutation where the resulting scent gives an impression of the pomander. It's also interesting to note that Besserer's hands are occupied by a rosary, with which he is sort of uttering a prayer because you can see his mouth is parted. The pomander in the portrait is creating a fragrant atmosphere for his worship. For Besserer, we can gather some understanding of the significance of the pomander scent. Not only is it the smell of protection from harmful maladies, but also the scent connected to prayer and devotion. So this was a brief review of the different approaches to developing scents in heritage projects, and it shows the varying avenues into exploring smell and the broad range of ways in which scents can be developed and diffused, spanning from portable blotters to those static foot pumps. The scents are used to reveal bygone atmospheres, the early modern imagination, long-lost recipes, and past medical practices. They recharge the heritage object with smell, such as the forgotten scents of the Amsterdam canals or the rotting cheese of the Kleine Landschaft. In my discussion, I covered some of the challenges encountered when working with smells in heritage projects and the best practices for working with odors. For instance, I covered the sensitivity that is required when audiences engage with scent. This included bridging the gap between pleasant scents and difficult narratives, and being aware of the impact that the scents can have on visitors, including malodors, and the conservation considerations of using particular compounds in scents. All of these observations will be shared in the olfactory storytelling toolkit, which is currently under development by Europa, and Cecilia will be able to share some more on that. As the number of olfactory heritage projects are growing by the year, the projects at the Mauritshuis and Museum Ulm cannot be regarded as ephemeral experiments. They belong to an expanding field of olfactory heritage. And at this very moment, there are olfactory exhibitions on display across Europe. To give you some idea of the diversity of approaches, I'll give just 4. So the Prado Museum in Madrid is displaying their exhibition, The Essence of a Painting, an Olfactory Exhibition. And it's curated by Alejandro Vergara from the Prado and Gregoria Sola, who's a perfumer at Puig. And the show focuses on one of the Prado's most treasured paintings, Jan Bruegel and Rubens's paintings of the sense of smell from their series of the senses. And visitors are able to smell 10 fragrances which were selected from different scented elements within the painting. And this includes orange blossom, jasmine, and civet, which I mentioned earlier is that secretion from a civet cat used in perfumery. And I've heard from the visitors that there are queues snaking outside of the gallery. Another project is at Constantine Hawkins' home in Hofwijk in Voorburg, just outside of The Hague. And you'll recall that I said in the introduction that Hawkins, who loved the flowers of Daniel Segers, was an amateur perfumer. Ineke Hausman at the Hawkins Institute and her colleagues have put his perfumery to the test by reconstructing a handwritten recipe of his. He called it Riekend Water van mijn moeder, or my mother's perfumed water in English. Using early modern distillation techniques, the researchers were able to follow the recipe as close as possible to Hawkins's process, even using herbs picked from the gardens at Hofwijk. By working with the cosmetics company, coincidentally called Hawkins in Paris, and a perfumer from Givaudan, they developed a scent and a scented candle for visitors to try. Over 3 centuries later, Hawkins's perfume once again lingers in the halls of Hofwijk. Abstract art is approached in experimental olfactory ways in Mondrian Moves at the Kunstmuseum in The Hague, curated by former Ode Europa member Karel Verbeek, alongside the museum's director, Benno Tempel. The show marks 150 years since Piet Mondrian's birth by showcasing the museum's extensive collection of his works and works by artists who were clearly influenced by him. The rhythmic and dynamic qualities of Victory Boogie Woogie has not only inspired a piece of techno music, which is played in the exhibition, it's also been a source of inspiration for perfumers at IFF to develop a fragrance. Visitors can also smell the scents that evoke Mondrian studios in Amsterdam, Paris, and New York. And a final case is Sensational books at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, curated by Catherine Rudy and Emma Smith. In defiance of e-readers, the show explores the materiality of books. It invites visitors to investigate the sensorial experience of reading. Following similar methodologies to Odeteka's and Cecilia's projects, the scents from some of the most significant books in the collection have been picked up using headspace technology. The olfactory profiles have been reconstructed and developed into a fragrance. Visitors to the Bodleian are able to smell the scent of the Magna Carta, as well as Shakespeare's first folio from 1623. If there were to be one thread that runs throughout the approaches, it would have to be a good story. The accompanying scents cannot be regarded as atmosphere enhancers to simply fragrance a museum experience. In every case, the scents that have been developed are a tool to enrich the heritage object. The scents are a way of getting better acquainted with an extensive and largely under-researched aspect of history. They direct our attention to particular facets of the work, facets that we may not have ever been aware of beforehand. The olfactory has so many rich narratives that are waiting to be explored. The scent and heritage object are married by a story that is worth telling, and once they're brought together, it has a powerful effect. It's only a matter of time until we'll know how effective these projects are. Ode Europa is currently measuring the impact of the olfactory guided tours at Museum Ulm to gather a sense of just how profound the narratives and the scents can be. As we await the results, I can share just a couple of my own observations. People who have grown up with the Mauritshuis's collection have shared how their understandings of the paintings have been completely transformed through visiting the exhibition. They say that they would never look at the works in the same way. I've also observed tours at Museum Ulm where young adults have participated with rapt attention, transfixed on the content as much as the scents. It's the agility of smell that means that people of different ages and backgrounds can engage with it. Strangers are compelled to talk to one another, to discuss the sensations that they are experiencing. And that's why Marie Clapeau, who works in the education department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, has termed olfactory heritage projects as the democratic leveler. In an age where a great deal of audience engagement is taking place online, this is a pull to bring people back into the museum. And as the past few years have weakened our networks and communities, heritage sense can be a way of drawing communities back together again. There are diverse research opportunities and audiences who are so willing to participate in olfactory heritage practices. This field holds so much promise for enriching and meaningful experiences in the museum, and I hope you will join us in developing it. Thank you very much.
so much, Lizzie, for this talk, and I'm sure nose-provoking talk.
Indeed.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
No, thank you.
If not, I might have a question, if that's okay.
Please.
There have been, and you've shown some amazing examples of olfactory engagement in museums. I suppose it's very difficult to imagine scents of the past, and we've talked about some scents that perhaps are best not presented in a museum experience. Is there a danger, perhaps, that with some of these exhibitions or some of the smells we might Disneyfy heritage? I'm sure you've thought about it.
Yeah, I think that's, it's certainly a risk that it can just be reduced to an attraction. And I think that in a way that does injustice to how rich the history is. And I think really that just goes back to what I was saying towards the end about just how compelling it is to put together a good story. Because, you know, on first impressions, you can maybe pick out sort of odorous things in works of art and heritage objects and have a smell that will just be very representative of it. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. And actually, I hope that people will be able to use Odoropa's research as a resource in order to deepen the narratives that people are creating, so that actually it doesn't have to be a sort of Disneyfied attraction in a museum, but something that's incredibly enriching. I think that in order to get people to look at a work of art in a whole new way and have those sorts of accounts that I was hearing from people at the Mojca exhibition, for instance, you have to do that research. It requires a lot of time and energy to do it, but the results are so much more, I think, rich and deeper if all of that extra legwork is put in to do it. And indeed, it's difficult, but we're hoping that we're providing that resource for people, curators in museums and education offices to create those more sort of profound and compelling stories.
Thank you so much, Lizzie. Thank you. Can we thank again, please, with a short...
Our next speaker is Dr. Cecilia Bembibre from the University College London Institute for Sustainable Heritage. The title of her presentation is Smell as Cultural Heritage. Cecilia Bembibre developed a framework to identify and preserve historic odors using a heritage science approach for her PhD project, Smell of Heritage. She previously researched smell at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Buenos Aires. Cecilia is interested in an interdisciplinary approach to smell and the preservation of olfactory heritage. In Odoropa, Cecilia worked on the preservation, reconstruction, and communication of European heritage smells. Please.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I want to thank the Odoteca team for the invitation and the University of Ljubljana for hosting us today, and all of you for coming. As Lizzie was finishing her presentation, I was thinking it's so reassuring to know that there are so many conservators interested in this, because someone will have to conserve all that art that we're creating. So it's especially warm welcome to all of you, and it's a huge task ahead. Today I would like to offer a glimpse of the work going on under the banner of olfactory heritage. So what is olfactory heritage, and how do we ring-fence this little field, and how do we define it and bring it forward? So I titled it Smell as Heritage. So how do smells become heritage? We know that for material heritage, we have certain guidelines and criteria for identifying different types of value of buildings and objects, artifacts. With intangible heritage, we also know, because UNESCO has developed ways of identifying practices and know-how that are worth protecting. What happens with sensory heritage? When we perceive, when we experience the world every day, we do it with our 5 senses. However, when we engage with the past, especially in a museum, we do it mostly with our eyes. So there's a part of the experience we're missing. We are trying to bring some of those experiences back with the work we're doing, but how do we ensure that we don't lose the heritage that we still have today, that we can pass it to future generations? So at the moment, there's no guidelines or systematic way of identifying those smells that have cultural value and preserving them for the future from the point of view of heritage bodies. Everything is a little bit experimental, and I would like to share 4 ways in which initiatives are being created to identify and protect sensory heritage, specifically smells. The first one, I'm going clockwise here from top left, is the Ministry of Japan's project in 2001, where they invited people to vote for places in the country that had good fragrance, so smelled good. And people voted, and they created a list of 100 places of good fragrance. These range from natural heritage, so parks, for example, as you see in the picture, and hot springs, to historic buildings, but also commercial streets, temples, all sorts of things. And they gave them a seal, a special seal, and the tourist board promotes them as examples of Japanese cultural heritage, because visiting these places and experiencing the smell of these places connects people to the identity of the space and provides a sense of dignity. They call it dignity, which I think is beautiful. There's a French researcher called Victor Fregnot who has done a lot of work on this case study, if you want to know more. But this is the first example that I wanted to share because it's really a participatory approach to deciding what is our smell heritage. The second example was provided by UNESCO in 2018 when they inscribed the perfume-making region, the French perfume-making region of Grasse, as Intangible Heritage of Humanity. Grasse is a region in France that traditionally, many years ago, was famous for its leathers, and it was a very bad-smelling region, as any for the provision of tanneries, of course. So then they realized that this region was very beneficial for growing scented plants, and the perfume industry was developed in the same place. And there was a bridge between the tanneries and the perfume industry, which was the profession of the glove maker perfumer, because of course perfume leather gloves were all the rage. And I wonder if any of you have worked with perfume gloves before in museums, because when you approach these objects now, they don't tend to smell, and this is something that we can discuss later. So what they protected, interestingly enough, is the know-how and the expertise around smell. Then we have a French sensory law that was passed in January 2021. And this is a very interesting case. This is something that happens all across Europe, which was there were a lot of complaints from people from the city going into the countryside and encountering unexpected smells and sounds and complaining about it. This has to do, of course, with the way our life is developed and how people who live in the city perhaps have an idealized way of what the rural life is, and they have certain expectations, and then they encounter reality where animal smells. There's manure, of course, and there's the rooster waking you up and the neighbor pigs grunting, etc. So what measures did they take? They decided to protect the smells and the sounds of the countryside as heritage. But interestingly enough, this is not a heritage-motivated law. It is the first case where heritage was written into French law, but it's not motivated by a desire to protect heritage. It's motivated by the desire to manage other nuisance and regulate somehow these complaints. And this is a very interesting case for this study because people who had done research into these case studies have shown that those in charge of creating these inscriptions of every region in France to catalog these valuable sensory expressions are not trained to do so. So this is a good example of how policymaking in olfactory heritage has to really be considered and well-researched. But still, lucky the French, they protect their smells and sounds. And finally, I thought this was a really nice example. This is the Slovenian Tourism Board, and this is a promotion of tourism in Slovenia with smell. And this is part of an international campaign. So there's the smell of the sea and salt, but there's another banner that is the smell and the knowledge of botanicals in Slovenia, which tells you a lot, I think, of the potential that you have here. Okay, so once we decide that smells are worth preserving, which smells are worth preserving? Do we go around and preserve every historic smell, every living smell, just in case we might lose some heritage? This is something that is not defined, and in Odd Europa we're doing work to try to understand what kinds of smells are worth calling heritage. So we've come with 4 definitions, and I'd be happy to hear your impressions, and you're very welcome to disagree. So first one is objects with cultural significance. So smells that are standalone objects. Perfumes being the most obvious, so you don't need a clear reference. It's not an attribute of a source, right? It's a work of art in itself. And then you have perfume ingredients or historic perfume ingredients. My colleague Lizzie mentioned a few. Some of them are not available to use in their natural form, but they're synthetic forms, so myrrh, civet, etc. Then we have smells as attribute of historic objects and spaces because they carry valuable information on those and on those spaces and people as well, of course. And then they're worthy of study and protection. Lizzie gave a few examples for pomanders, for example. Mattia and I worked together on the smell of historical libraries. And then we have other places. Very often we're approached in Odd Europa, people from a village somewhere in Europe, and they say, our village has a very special smell because we haven't smelled it anywhere else. How can we keep it? How can we preserve this smell as heritage? We don't have an answer yet. Then we have the smells associated with cultural practices, and they are significant for a certain community. So, for example, the millers use their noses to determine when the flour is ready. I think in the room we have a lot of nose expertise because you work with materials, you have been working with materials for years, and you know the smell of these materials. Perhaps it's not formal knowledge, but I'm pretty sure that there's so much knowledge in the room about how a material degrades, how you treat a material, and all this information you gain that you haven't been trained for is something that we could call heritage. And then finally, we have smells that we use in heritage research and presentation. And these are the smells that we're distributing today. And they are categories in themselves, so we call them reconstructions when we have the formula and we can create the same smell, chemically the same smell that an object had, for example, or has. Or we can carry out the scientific analysis necessary to achieve that information. We call them interpretations when there's a mediation by someone who developed a version of that smell because we cannot access or we don't want to access the original. So there's work being done around authenticity of those smells as well. And now, perhaps I'll skip this slide because I think Lizzie presented Europa beautifully. I just wanted to say that we work together in this big European project. We have 2.8 million euros to investigate the smell of Europe for 3 years. We're halfway through the project. The core of the project was the intention to access digital collections that museums have developed in the last 20 years, and instead of querying them with our eyes, to query them with our nose. So provide different access to digital collections. And for that, our colleagues, computer science, in Italy, in Germany, you can see all the partners there, and in the Netherlands, are developing artificial intelligence tools, techniques, to train computers to see smell in paintings, engravings, and graphics, and to find references to smells in text. They also index smell gestures and smell objects and a variety of categories. The project also has the goal of developing policy initiatives and a policy strategy to safeguard smells as heritage. Okay, so between Europa and there's something in the air again, as my colleague said today, there's momentum because cultural heritage is really embracing the senses. I am not going to go over the exhibitions because I think, again, my colleague gave a good glimpse, but what I want to say is that we have now an incredible opportunity to gather information because we're measuring different types of impact of including smell in museums at the moment, and I'll talk more in detail about this later. And we have the opportunity to go and see how other people do it as well. So we've been to the Prado Museum, we've been to the Maurits House, we have been to Tate Modern, to the Sensory Odyssey, to the Bodleian exhibition, and we are doing questionnaires with audiences. We're measuring a series of parameters, preventive conservation studies in these museums, so we really can gather data, and next year we will have a lot of information on all sorts of impacts of smell in museums. But how do you research olfactory heritage? This is a very complex field because it's very new, but also because it has to be considered from many points of view. So what we do in Europa is we have a very multidisciplinary team. Odoteca also does. And we discuss from what words mean, because we all arrive with our own ideas of what authenticity means in heritage, for example, and then you find your colleague uses the same word and means a completely different thing, or takes it for granted sometimes. But we also involve industry, so we work with perfumers, the heritage sector, we work with museums, conservators, curators. It's important in museums that the different departments have a say in what we do, because we often find that curators are very excited to work with smells, and conservators are very concerned. So this dialogue can be facilitated with information, and this is also what we're doing in all of these projects. So here I will share a framework that I developed during my PhD project to preserve smells with cultural significance. And this is a 4-step framework. And I will talk a little bit about it because I know my colleagues in Odoteca will start building on this framework and take it much further. The first step is something I discussed and something we do when we want to decide if something is heritage, which is it significant? Is it significant enough to care for it and pass it to future generations? So how do we develop a criteria for smells? We have some bases. For example, the Barra Charter talks about aesthetic significance, and the sounds and the smells of a place are considered part of this aesthetic value of historic buildings, and therefore they're worthy of preservation, so we can build on that. But there's much more to do, because when we talk about smell, we're also talking about intangible heritage. And when we talk about intangible heritage, we talk about living heritage, and that involves communities, because this is living heritage. So participatory approaches are essential to establish a criteria, because a smell might not be significant to everyone, but it might have a lot of value for a certain community. And the knowledge is held in that community, so we need to work together. The second step, once we establish that a smell is worth preserving, is characterize it, because we want to document it. So we do that first looking at volatile organic compounds, so the chemical composition of the smell. We use analytical chemistry techniques, GCMS, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, to take samples of the scented air, to understand, so do qualitative analysis, understand what's in that air, what compounds are there, and how much, so quantitative analysis as well. And then, once we have the chemical analysis done, we want to understand smell as a perception. Because, of course, to call it smell, there needs to be a nose to smell it. And for that, we conduct sensory analysis. We have several techniques for these. Odor evaluation panels, for example, when you give a sample of the smell to a panel, or you take them to a specific place and you ask them to record their impressions on intensity, quality of the smell, so the way you describe it, and then hedonic tone, pleasantness and unpleasantness. And this is very important, because when we're dealing with historic smells, for example, we need to take into account that we don't smell the same way people smelled in the past, and probably not the same way people will smell in the future either. We don't have the same references, we don't have the same sensibility to smells. Imagine the smell of meat, rotting meat perhaps, and how people would consider it before the fridge was invented. Our tolerance has changed so much. So this is really important, that we anchor the sensory qualities of a smell today in Ljubljana by this panel, for example. And the other analysis that we do is gas chromatography olfactometry. This is an instrumental technique for sensory analysis, and involves smelling the separated compounds in a mixture and characterizing them, again, in terms of intensity, hedonic tone, and quality. What do we do with that data? So then we have a list of chemical compounds that we identify, and then we have a list of words. And with the words, it's really challenging, because you can do your standardized analysis, but if you work with communities, they will come and they will tell you whatever they want, their personal stories. So how do you match acetic acid with smells like my grandmother's house? It's really hard to work with such diverse data. So what we try to do is, first of all, we try to train ourselves to describe the smells with a universal language that is referenced with literature, but yet again, there are traps everywhere. That language was developed with a very Eurocentric view. So when we are analyzing smells that are from other parts of the world, we need to take into account that other people have different associations and ways of talking about smell. For example, the smell of mango, for us, is a fruit. In Thailand, is a flower. So they would say it's a flowery smell. So knowing all of this, it takes time, of course, and exchange. When we have the chemical information and the sensory information, we create an archival tool, for example, this odor wheel. And you've seen the other one with historic books in Lizzie's presentation. And this is something that we can use both to engage the public, but to inform ourselves, in your practice. You smell something, and then you can check if that compound might be present. And finally, step 4, this is a step that I haven't developed during my PhD, but I'm hoping everyone else will, which is the archival of historic smells. And for that, I trust my Odoteca colleagues to do it brilliantly. Imagine if when you go to a library, you could not only take out a book, but you could also take out a smell. and experience it as you experience a book. There's an initiative developed during the pandemic called the Book Sniffers Club. When people couldn't go to libraries because libraries were closed, they met online with their favorite book, they sniffed the book, and they talked about it. And the talks, at the beginning, the chats were about smell, but then they started being about, oh, this book was given to me by a friend, and my friend is no longer here. Or, I read this book on holiday, and this was so meaningful to me. So smell is also a way of connecting communities, and this echoes what Lizzie was saying. When you stage an olfactory exhibition, the museum gets so loud. People get so close to the object. I know I'm alarming you all, but it's really something that you have to see. People laugh, they move as if they're not in a museum. So this is really, really interesting to see. So here, how am I doing for time? Am I okay? Yes? I will tell you a little about a case study that I did. This was St. Paul's Cathedral's library in central London. You have the cathedral there on the left. And this was a first case study to take a smell that we know we value because we know we like the smell of old books and historic libraries. In this particular library, if you look at the visitors' books, there are lots of quotes of visitors saying, I can inhale the knowledge. The library is kept closed and it can be visited by appointment only. So the smell is quite intense, was quite intense, and I'll tell you this sad story in a minute. And it's a reasonably small library specialized in sacred texts. The chamber was designed by Sir Christopher Wren. So here we did solid phase microextraction, a technique to sample some of those volatiles in the air. And we conducted laboratory analysis. Here I am sitting at the GCO, so that's the technique for sensory analysis. And we created that smell from the chemical information. But what we wanted to know is chemical authenticity the main variable for the public to consider a smell authentic? When we archive a smell, what other information we need? So, Mattia and I had a crazy idea. We invited a perfumer to go to the library, smell the library, and now we're going to give you a chance to do this, and go to her workshop. She doesn't work with gas chromatography, she works with intuition and expertise, and she recreated her experience of the library. So now you can smell a library. I couldn't physically bring St. Paul's Cathedral today, but I did my best. So what you're smelling is a recreation of the smell of St. Paul's Cathedral Library by Sarah Mccartney. This is what she said about this smell. And I'm prompting you, those of you who haven't smelled it, because I'm giving you the words already. What I wanted to say is that we presented this chemically authentic smell that we created in the lab, and this interpreted smell that had no strong connection, chemical connection to the source, only an emotional connection. We gave it to a panel of people and we asked, which of these two smells is more effective in evoking old books and historic libraries? Do you know what they said? Anyone wants to guess? Which smell won? Which one was more effective? Sorry? The smell that won was the perfume. Slightly. So it was 50-50. So the chemically accurate reconstruction was as effective as the emotional interpretation, artistic interpretation. So Sarah did a wonderful job, but this study told us a lot about the idea of authenticity in heritage smells and how we can explore, unexpected routes, because perfumers have this way of evoking emotions, but also, in some cases, knowing what the chemically authentic smell is very helpful and essential for archival. So I'm in favor of both. but happy to discuss again. And finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about these presentation techniques. I'll skip because I think Lizzie covered it beautifully, but I'll talk about impact measurement. In Europa, we're doing two kinds of impact measurement. One is impact on the public. So we are going to all of these exhibitions and the ones that we organize ourselves in the project. So for example, the Amsterdam tours, the Ulm exhibition. And we're asking people to define and talk about what they find valuable. Is it about having smell in the museum? Do they find it more informative, more emotional? Do they find it more entertaining? Would they pay more to attend an exhibition with smell? We want to know all these things. And then we're going to have a sample of about 500 from all around Europe, and then we'll share the results, of course. And then the other impact measurement study that we're conducting is preventive conservation, as I mentioned. So all of these museums are using, as Lizzie showed, different techniques. Some of them are presenting point of scent, so the blotters to the public. So that's a smell that goes, and then they put it in the bin. Some people are doing little cubes where you have to lift the lid, but normally the smell is not constantly diffused. Tate, for example, which is the picture you can see with these weird sculptures in the back, diffused 28 smells for about 6 months in the turbine hall. I hope I'm getting the numbers right, but around this area, non-stop. And we don't know yet what the impact is. So Prado Museum has a machine that is next to a painting, the Rubens, Bruegel Rubens, without the glass, and they're having 100 visitors an hour, constantly puffing scent into the air. The curators are not preoccupied at all. I haven't managed to talk to the conservators. But I think they were okay with it because they gave the green light, you know? So we want to know more. We're doing several kinds of measurements. We're doing total VOC measurements and using the published conservation guidelines of indoor air quality museums as reference, but we hope to develop our own guidelines of what is a safe level in PPB of total VOCs to have in a room where you present smell. We're doing audit testing, and I know my Odoteca colleagues might be talking about that later, so I won't go into detail. You can see a picture there. And then we're doing SPIMI in some exhibitions. So, how do we put all of this together? This is my final slide, so and I don't expect you to read, but I just wanted to say, going back to my idea, the museum has to work together. Heritage professionals, we need to work together. So we asked conservators, curators, olfactory exhibition designers, and visitor experience managers what their concerns were, what would they like to know before they give the green light, they develop an olfactory exhibition. Because we know many museums want to, but they don't know how to or they don't dare. And so we're trying to provide this data. And we'll do this by developing an olfactory storytelling toolkit, which will have the data from our impact measurements, the data from our case studies, information on how to develop storylines, information on how to engage the public, and how to provide the public with honest, transparent information about how the scents are created, about the safety sheets that they can access. So first it starts with training heritage professionals, sharing this information with you. So the final column has all the work to do. The green categories are the ones that are already done. The yellow ones we hope to achieve in Europa. The red ones I'm going to pass over to all of you to do in the future. So there's a lot of work to do in this respect, and I'm happy to discuss it. And to do this work, we need to involve all stakeholders. So we need to involve the organizations that develop heritage guidelines to make them aware of these. At the moment, for example, in UNESCO, you don't have any category to register the olfactory, the sensory value of an expression of heritage as intangible heritage. So we're working with them in this. We're working with the various European infrastructures, like IRIS, for example. We are working with ICROM people, and also with the Fondation des Sciences du Patrimoine in France. And then we're working with the industry sector, because perfumers are really interested in this, and they volunteer the expertise to recreate these scents. And this is a wonderful thing to do, because the more diversity, the more knowledge we create, and also it gives us the opportunity of working with local perfumers who know more about certain aspects of heritage. And then, obviously, we'll open new markets, new applications for instrument analysis, etc., etc. And I'm going to conclude by thanking everyone who supported this research and inviting you for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Are there any questions?
I can speak like this, I think it's fine now.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask, what was the information to convince conservators to allow you to proceed with this kind of exhibitions? Or were they simply overruled, which happens a lot in museums?
What an excellent question, thank you. At the moment, in the project, we developed 2 exhibitions, so maybe Lizzie can answer about Maurits' house. In all museums, the same person does all the curation and the conservation, so it's the one-person team. And she was quite involved in selecting the way of distributing the scent. So they went for point of scent, and perhaps we can share the technology they used is very, very localized. But in Prado, for example, where they have the smell diffusing it, they weren't very concerned, but they're interested, because now they're thinking of extending the exhibition. So now they want data. And I think what convinces conservators is data. You know, we need to prove either that it's completely safe to do this. We have every indication. Let me preface by that, because it's not a completely unexplored topic, of course. There's, I think, no clear indication that most VOCs that we use are damaging to collections. We know that, but specifically for perfumes developed on purpose, the introduction of new VOCs in the museum, this hasn't been thoroughly and systematically tested, so we need to produce the data. And this is what my colleagues from Odoteca are going to do. We are collaborating in this measurement, of course. So I'm hoping in a year's time, I'll come back and I'll give you data to say that it's either completely safe, or these are the guidelines that we need to show, to follow, to do it safely. But thank you for your question, because it's perhaps one of the most important questions.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Oh, yes, sorry. Do you want me to do it now? Or? Okay. And the question was, sorry, how can we convince conservators that this is a safe practice, introducing new smells, new VOCs into the museum?
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. We now have 3 short presentations by researchers in the Odoteca team. They're shorter because we've just started doing the work, so we don't have so much to say as do our colleagues from the Ode Europa project. But it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Mojca Ramšak, who joins us from the University of Ljubljana. She's Professor of Cultural and Social Anthropology at the University of Ljubljana and Professor of Anthropology at the Institutum Studiorum Humanitatis in Ljubljana. She's a researcher, postgraduate professor, and writer in the field of ethnology, cultural and social anthropology, folklore, medical humanities, and history of medicine. She's by far the most interdisciplinary researcher I've ever known, and I'm really looking forward to your talk, Mojca.
Thank you, Professor Sterlich. Thank you, dear Mattia. Thank you, Cecilia and Lizzie. Me and I think also everybody in this room couldn't enjoy more than we did when we were listening to your presentation. But as an anthropologist, I studied ethnology and later I developed anthropologist. And when I joined this project, my first question was, if there is something in the air, what would an anthropologist do to catch the uncatchable? How would the anthropologist develop the idea about the uncatchable? And how would we write a good story, an appealing story that the audience would believe and be convinced? So in this presentation, I'm going to tell you actually working definition of anthropology of smell and some roads or some lines where we could go with this topic. Of course, I am not the first one to write or to talk about it. There were several researchers before me who did it better than I do. And the most serious work started in the 80s with Canadian colleagues, with French colleagues, but I don't have time to go to these details. What I want to present now is first the definition. What would anthropology of smell be? So I imagine that anthropology of smell examines culturally conditioned perceptions of smell, cultural characteristics of smell. Anthropology is also interested first in the sociocultural elements that influence other perceptions and its cultivation from early age on. And second, in the orders that shape our attention to others. Just imagine when you meet somebody, there is something on that person for sure that catch your attention. It might be the look of the person, it might be the smell of the person. And so how could we catch this as anthropologists? And in addition, the anthropology of smell explores the symbolic dimensions of smell as a bearer of moral norms and aesthetic values. The meanings of smell in everyday life that range from love, from eroticism, to hatred, and to racist and xenophobic olfactory stereotypes about the others. And then the ways in which smell is articulated in language. So let me tell you a few words about language. So linguistic anthropology is also deeply involved in this topic, and linguistic anthropology tries to understand how did we start to use words connected to smell. How did these words develop and how they were connected to our everyday life activities. And this is really very appealing topic, and a lot of things have been done from anthropologists working in Germany, working in United Kingdom, and so on. Also in applied sense, I must mention this because it's not unimportant, and applied sense of anthropology of smell would be connected also to your work. What could a museum worker do with the smell? How can the smell be presented in the museum? And then just imagine we are living in a world that stinks very much, especially if we live in urban environments. So how can we help with our knowledge to make this environment more pleasant? Okay, smell, of course, doesn't exist on its own. Maybe chemists would try to argue with me, but for us, anthropologists, The smell is living in a world with other things. So smell per se doesn't exist for anthropologists. We always must consider the smell in a contextual way. So who used the smell, how it was used, why it was used, how it affected people, and so on. Of course, we can also research sensory training. So how do we teach our children to smell? And how do we teach them to react to smells? How do we teach them to clean themselves, to wash hands, and teach them these norms that are self-evident to us? But for anthropology of smell, this cultivation of smell is also a very important topic. The smell is, of course, very much connected with olfactory habits, with our beliefs, with our prejudice about the others, with conceptions, and this sensory training that I just mentioned. So we can't say that smell exists in a vast space, let's say. It's always existing in a space that is full of other things. And when we combine these other things to smell, then we get this image that anthropologists are trying to catch. Until recently, it was a general consensus that the sense of smell is the most linguistically neglected of all 5 senses. Why? Because we use not so much words on smell as we use them on sight or as we use them on hearing. So this is the main difference. We use less words to describe smell than we use for other senses. So in this way, it was neglected. But newest researches show that it might not be always like this, because there are numerous people living on this world who use much more words for smell than that we expected. And here is the map of such indigenous people who have very vivid and picturesque descriptions of smell. Then another thing that is important for anthropology is how to classify what we are doing. We have to put things in certain drawers. So we have to make a classification that works for us. And what works for us in anthropology is to make a qualitative description of smell. For instance, we describe smells as good smells versus bad smells. And this is very common in everyday life. Then we describe smells as natural smells, which we try to avoid, and artificial smells. These two fields are covered by anthropology and by linguistics. And then in medicine, especially in history of medicine, we have another division. We have hot smells and we have cold smells. What does it mean? It means that smells are attached to body fluids as they were understood in antiquity. And some smells, which represented hot smells, also represented people with more energy, with more phlegma, and so on. So this is this main division. And then, of course, it was said many times today, we can divide smells as chemists would do, or people from perfume industry would do, like base smells, like hard or middle smells, and top note smells. So these are these basic divisions that could be useful when we work with smells in anthropology. But of course, and unfortunately, we don't have a universal rule how to do it here in Slovenia, how to do it in Japan, how to do it in any part of the world. There is no universal rule. We have to go to the field, we have to put our boots on, actually, and discover what people think and how people use smells, and then why. This question, why do they use smells in the way they do? Why? Because smells were existentially important for people from very early on. For instance, imagine hunters. They relied on their smell. They should not smell too much, otherwise animals would escape and he would be hungry and he would not bring anything at home. So they relied on smells, and this existential need caused that people started to talk and invent words for smell and also behavior for smell. We don't only talk about the smell with the words. If I do this, you would probably understand what I mean. If I do this, you would also understand what I mean. But it's not culturally specific. We understand because we are from the same cultural environment, but maybe in other environments from the past, these gestures would not be understood at all. So we can express smell with words, with our body language, and in many other ways. So if I go to this first classification, good versus bad smells, this one I think is the most common and the most important also for anthropology. So we describe the quality of smell with good or bad. And now how? We have pleasant smells and versus unpleasant smells. We have life, which smells good, and we have decay, rotten things that have terrible smell. Then smell can be attributed also to symbolic meanings, like I said before. Morality, virtues, smell good, smell nice, smell sweet. But if we talk about somebody with moral impurities, then we probably associate this person with bad smell. Then we can talk about toxicity, about the disease, strangers. This is a very important topic, strangers. We describe strangers in this right column with bad smells. So strangers always stink. We are afraid to acknowledge that they might also smell good. Then we have certain social groups, like Roma people, like Jews, for instance, who also in our imagination have bad smell. And then, of course, we have stinking animals, and this is the most logical part, I think. Okay, so, well, we perceive millions of different smells, and I'm not going to go to this neuro-linguistic topic because I'm short with time. Yes. We always describe smells in connection with our taste. For instance, if something smells sweet, we connect it with our sweet taste, and similar to bitter, sour, and so on. So it's always very much connected. Also, I want to mention one thing, that smell and life cycle are very much connected, especially if we talk about religion. Cecilia and Lizzie, thank you. Lizzie already mentioned several things about smell and religion, and they mentioned plants that were used in religious ceremonies and so on. So it is also part of our anthropological investigation. Of course, smells can also trigger very strong emotions in us. We might smell something that reminds us of something terrible that happened in our past life, or that reminds us of something nice that happened in our past life. And then we are flooded with our emotions about this smell. Yeah, here, of course, I'm giving you contrasts. Roma people near Novo Mesto in Slovenia in 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, and almost today. So they live in terrible conditions still, and Roma people are always connected with bad smell. I'm going to give you an example. Janez Trdina and other writers wrote how police can catch Roma people by smell, because they smell on mouse and rats and urine and so on. And so when they smelled this smell, they knew that Roma did something in this area. And then, of course, the noses. We are blessed with bigger or smaller noses. And noses are also one of the topics that are very, very much symbolically connected with smell. We attach certain characteristics to people with big noses and another characteristics to people with small noses. We discussed earlier when we had lunch together that there is a museum of cut noses, so noses from the statues. They were cut because when emperors were changed, they were so, they just wanted to demolish their noses, and they cut the noses away. So there is a museum of this. And then let's just conclude. So if we like it or not, we are surrounded with smells in that way or in another way. We get like fragrant gifts which we like or which we don't like. That's up to us. And also sexual life is not an unimportant topic for us anthropologists. We have several stories and several accounts on, for instance, how people kiss. They don't always kiss mouth to mouth. For instance, this Eskimo kiss is very important because they kiss by rubbing noses together. And by doing that, it's called kiss in their culture, they smell each other. They smell each other. And then you know also examples of people who had bad body odor and their relationships just went dead because of that. So sad. And so on and so on. So I could go with examples for an hour or so. I'm limited with time, I have to finish. I didn't make a strong conclusion because I just wanted to give you an impression what we can do with it. But since this is my last slide, and since we live in a world that hates so much, I invite you that today you kiss somebody you like or love very much and smell that person, and you would feel better than you feel right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mojca. I'm so sorry we've given you only 15 minutes. I know you could talk about this topic for hours. And I'm sure that there will be an opportunity at some point in the future. But you've really introduced us to the topic of anthropology of smell very effectively, and I'll go around kissing people in the afternoon.
Next speaker is our young colleague and co-worker on Odoteca project, Emma Paulin from the University of Ljubljana, Heritage Science Laboratory, Faculty of Chemistry and Chemical Technology. The title of her presentation is Conservation Aspects of Smell in the Museum. Emma Paulin is a PhD researcher at the Faculty of Chemistry and Chemical Technology at the University of Ljubljana. She received her master's degree in science for the conservation restoration of cultural heritage at the University of Bologna with a thesis project focused on Raman spectroscopy of synthetic pigments. She now works on the project Odoteca, where she explores the smells of historic objects and how these could be safely used in museum exhibitions from the conservation point of view. Please.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Today, as your name mentioned, I'm going to talk about the conservation aspects when exhibiting smells in museum, but differently from the previous presentation, I'm going to talk more from a chemist's point of view. So during this presentation, I will introduce you why and where we can find smells in museums, to then move to the conservation concerns that we have to consider when we are exhibiting these smells. And I would like to conclude this presentation with the protocol that I've developed and I'm following at the moment to assess VOCs present indoor. So at first, why we have smells in museum? Okay, you have great presentation before me, so I think that now you know why we have smells in museum, and the study of smells in GLAMS environments, so gallery, libraries, archives, and museum, greatly increased in the last years, especially thanks to these olfactory exhibitions that are exhibitions where smells play the main role in different ways. Smells can be the artwork itself. Smells can be seen as an engagement aid for visually impaired, or smells can be seen as an adding value of a physical object in the way to engage more the public. But when we are talking about smells, we have to chemically consider what smells are. And smells are volatile organic compounds that are organic compounds with a high vapor pressure at room temperature, and for this reason we have them present in gaseous form. And these VOCs are the responsible of the odors that we smell. These kind of compounds have a high volatility and reactivity. For this reason, when we exhibit olfactory exhibition in museums, we have to take in consideration that we can have adverse effects on human health, because we can have in these perfumes some irritating or some allergens that can affect the public that is smelling them. But this is not the point of my research, so I won't go further on or this point against considering the adverse effect on health. What are more interesting is about the degradation that can occur on exhibited objects, because exhibiting these kind of smells, we can have the formation of new degradation products, we can have hydrolysis or oxidation of the other objects present in the collection, and we can have cross-infection between different materials, because we know that in the museum we don't have most of the times one display case for each object, so we have several objects together and we can have the formation of this cross-infection degradation. And then we have also to consider that in the museums there are already other VOCs present as background. So this olfactory exhibition will be just an announcement of this background concentration. Maybe it can be seen as weird that in museums or indoor environment we have VOCs, because generally we think about museums like a very pure and controlled system, but actually inside the museums we have several sources that can emit VOCs. At first, we have emissions from museums objects. I think that one of the most common objects that everyone has experienced in their life is a book, as you can see here in the picture. Everyone has experienced the typical smell of books, and this smell is composed by VOCs. And like books, we have all the other objects that emit VOCs inside the museum's environment. Then we have to consider also all the furnishing in the museum. So the flooring, the wall paint, the display cases material, or the plastic present maybe in the sealant or in the rubber. Then we have to consider also the impact that visitor gives to the museum, because also visitor emits VOCs. And in particular, we know that there are some kind of people that really like to use a lot of perfume. They are heavily perfumed, and at the entrance of the museum, there are no restrictions for heavily perfumed people. So in this case, we have several VOCs indoor. And then, different from the first 3 points, we have the olfactory exhibition, that are the first intentional VOCs present in the museum. So what I wanted to do is evaluate these VOCs present indoor, and I follow this approach where at first I quantitatively determine the value of VOCs indoor with a total VOC sensor. Then I moved to the analysis using solid phase microstructure, where I determine qualitative which kind of compounds we have indoor. I moved on with the analysis with sorbent tools, because here I could combine both qualitative and quantitative information. And then after assessing how this emission works, I wanted to study how this emission, the effect of this emission on the material, so the reactivity in the material. And in the end, I wanted to analyze the pure museum's aromas. So the first step was the total VOC measurement. This measurement was performed with a VOC sensor that you can see in the picture on the right. This is a very small sensor that can allow us to get the determination of total amounts of volatile organic compounds present indoor. This is a very easy and fast system because we can get information in real time. As you can see from the graph, this is what the sensor connected to the computer gives us in real time. So after a couple of seconds that the sensor is in the environment, he can detect the total concentration of VOCs. Unfortunately, this gives us just a quantitative information, so just a number in ppb or ppm, so part per billion or part per millions, and we don't have qualitative information, so we don't know which kind of VOCs we are inside. So to overcome this problem, I used SPME, solid phase microstructure. This method of sampling works on the principle of absorption and adsorption on a fiber coated with a special extracting phase. This is called passive sampling because it takes advantages of the natural diffusion of air, and so we don't need the use of a pumping system. This tiny and small fiber, as you can see in the picture compared to a book, is very easy to use because we just need to expose to an environment, and then once we are back in the lab, we dissolve the fiber through a gas chromatography mass spectrometry system. This analytical method is a separation technique that allows us to separate the mixtures that we collect in the several compounds, and so we are able to determine which compounds we have in the environment. This fiber is dependent by the type of the coating surface that we have, so it is a bit selective, and for this reason we can get really good qualitative information, but we can get semi-quantitative information on the other hand. So we decided to move to the analyzing using sorbent tubes. These sorbent tubes are metal tubes packed with packing material. In our case, we use 10x TA. And you can perform the sampling both in diffusion, in active or passive way. The passive way is the diffusion way that I use also for SPME. But in my research, I use mainly in active way. So with the means of pumps that pumps the air in the sorbent tubes. The analysis is followed as SPME by GCMS analysis, where we can characterize which compounds we have in the indoor environment, but in our case, we couple this analysis also to GCO, that is gas chromatography olfactometry. This olfactometric port allows us not just to qualitative and quantitative chemically analyze the compounds present in the collected on the sorbent tubes, but at the same time we can smell these separated compounds because at the end of the olfactory port we have a nose-shaped port where we can smell all during all the chromatographic run. So with this technique we can get a very good footprint of the chemical information of the smells present in the environment, and at the same time we have a very good sensorial footprint. So after assessing how this emission works, I wanted to study how is the reactivity of these compounds related to the museum's objects. I followed with audit testing the protocol developed by British Museum with a slight modification, because the original protocol sees the interaction between three metal coupons that are copper, silver, and lead with a tested material in an oven at 60 degrees for 28 days in a saturated concentration of water vapor. Since we are analyzing VOCs, I didn't want to test a solid material, but the slight modification is the state of the sample, because I used a VOC solution. In my preliminary study, I used acetic acid, and I tested the material after 28 days. So here in the picture, you can see in the picture A, the coupon exposed to a low VOC concentration, and we see that we don't have a modification from the original state, but we can see that when we increase the concentration in a very high level of VOCs, we can have oxidation products present. The final estimation of the degradation with the OD test is just a visual examination. So after 28 days, we took out the samples from the oven and we visually compared them. In the past, several research work on the level of VOCs present indoor, and they developed suggested threshold to follow for VOCs in museum environment. This is the PAS 198, and you can see in the table the suggested concentration in ppb, so part per billion, for acetic acid, formic acid, and formaldehyde. But the research in the past was not just in determining suggested threshold, but it was extensively done to study smells in cultural heritage environments. Especially the smell of old books is one of the most researched heritage smells. And previous work were focused not just in the characterization of the material, thanks to the VOCs, but we recognize that it was possible also to determine the degradation products. And this was very helpful because with VOCs analysis that is not destructive towards the work of art, we can determine both the material composition and the degradation product at the same time. For example, in book analysis, we saw that we can determine the presence of lignin content due to this specific aroma like vanilla-like or almond-like due to vanillin and benzaldehyde present in it. But what was the main outcome of this analysis is that VOCs are emitted by these objects, and we cannot stop this emission, and we cannot separate this emission from the object. We cannot do a straight cut between the object and the smell. So we have to take in consideration that VOCs are intrinsic of the object itself. So the last step of my work in the field was the analysis of museums' aromas. After assessing how the VOCs emission works, after seeing their interaction, I studied the liquid perfumes that were used for olfactory exhibition in order to have an idea of what can be the future damage toward the works of art before of exhibiting it in the museum. So I would like to conclude this presentation with an open question. Considering that we have inside the museum emissions from the cultural heritage objects, emissions from visitors, emissions from the furnishing, do these olfactory exhibitions significantly enhance the existing risk? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Are there any questions? No? Mattia, maybe? Any questions?
We discuss these issues on a daily basis, so perhaps not,
Okay.
not right now.
Mm-hmm.
Can you get back to this audit test, because I didn't understand it clearly. What was the modification of the test itself to the classical one?
This one?
There is no... Oh, this one. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah. Oh, the original test was the interaction between the metal coupons with the solid testing material. So you generally have a piece of canvas or a piece of paper inside the vial. While we decided to test the VOCs, so we insert everything in the vial with water.
Are there any other questions?
Do you really think that someone that is over-perfumed can harm some piece of art? Do you have any proofs for that? Thank you.
At the moment, we don't know, but we are testing this because the concentration that we are using in all the tests is the concentration of a normal perfumed person. So we consider like 2 spritz of perfume, not more. And we saw that, for example, with acetic acid, it would have been a very high concentration. So now we are also testing this part.
Any other questions, maybe? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. It's a pleasure now to introduce Professor Tomasz Savoszczuk of the Krakow University of Economics and also the Polish coordinator of the Odoteca research project. He studied conservation chemistry, particularly related to historic paper, at the Jagiellonian University, and continued his research into the smells of historic and heritage environments at the Krakow University of Economics. He's the department lead there. He's the Polish coordinator of Odoteca, as I already mentioned, and works with researchers and conservators at the National Museum of Krakow. Over to you, Tomasz.
Thank you very much. Try to start it, but it's okay. Now it is there. I have to thank you, Cecil and Emma, because you explained many things that I can just keep in my presentation. So today I will try to tell something about the project that we started half a year ago. So Odoteca, the title Capture, Reconstruction and Conservation of Heritage Smells. And let's start on how the idea came to me about the project. At this point, I would like to stress that we will not measure only the smell of the objects. Very important for us is also this historical narrative about the object. So let's move one step further. Odoteca would have never appeared if some great love would have never had happened in the past. So that's how I am building the historical narrative about the project using the historical narrative about the object. But let's go back to this great love. It was the love of Ludovic Sforza to Cecilia Galeriani. He loved her so much that ordered Leonardo da Vinci to paint her portrait. We can see Cecilia, but also we see in the painting Ludovic Sforza itself. He is an ermine, and after many years he finished like this. He is now a mascot of the National Museum in Krakow that you can buy. Long story short, the paint was created. It's now exposed in the National Museum in Krakow in the Czartoryski department. At the beginning 2020, the direction of National Museum asked me for doing measurements in the chamber, in the display in which the painting is exhibited, because it was fresh and open exhibition. They wanted to be sure that it's safe for the object itself. So I was measuring the volatile organic compounds inside the displays, and at that time I thought, okay, I am one of the few people in the world that can approach this painting and sniff it, and it will be nice to bring this smell outside of this display and give it to the visitors, to the audience, especially the blind one. So that's how the idea came. So what we, at the beginning, what we think about the project, we wanted to establish smell as a part of object history. We had to carefully assess conservation risk, also risk of conservation of the smells itself, and establish impact on the visitors, I mean impact of the historical smells on the visitors in Poland and in Slovenia. As we know, the smell can change quite fast at the time, so we have to catch the point in the history. This is the official title of the project. The project is bilateral. Ljubljana and Krakow is involved in. In Poland, the financing is coming from National Science Center. In Slovenia, it's a Slovenian Research Agency. And we have, of course, great partners in the National Museum in Krakow, which are collaborating with us in the project, and partners even attending here today to the meeting from National Museum of Slovenia. What case study we already choose for the projects? It's of course Lady with Ermine, but also the snuff box of France Prescheren. These two objects were already written in the project at the stage that it was only proposal. And today morning we'll discuss more about other cases that should be considered in our project. So it's a mummy of Prince Akesuita from Luxor. Of course, there are the Slovenian cases. It's very important for Slovenian nation, Carniola Antiqua et Nova, it's a book. The wax seal of Maria Teresa Habsburg, and very important for the contemporary culture of Slovenia, Lex chair. And as the extra object, we will discuss today about the Art Deco perfume flask, which has some remains of the perfume inside. On the Polish side, we decide about the very huge object. It's 4 by 9 meters. It's a design of tinted glass window for one of the church in Krakow. It's very important for our history, especially that you know that we are a very Catholic country, so this object is important for us in the cultural way too. The another one, it's a motherhood. This is a pastel on a paperboard. It's also very important for Polish culture because it actually started the new artistic era in our country. The next one, Treaty of Krakow, called also Prussian homage. It's a document prepared on parchment. It's very important because this document actually finished over 300 years wars with the Teutonic Order, which was in the north of Poland. And plus, we have also a very big format painting, the same title, in which you can see that this document is passed between our king and the head of the Teutonic Order. And object from 70s, it's herbarium by Sapochnikova. It's, let me say, that the polymer form which was taken from her son and prepared as the part on the boards. And as the extra object also discussed today morning, we decided about the aromatic hygienic powder. It's coming from 1930. Actually, in this year, it got the gold medal at the exhibition in Paris for its value. And as I know already from the morning, we have in museum a used and unused box. So we can compare the smell both of them. Okay, so what are the main goals of the project? So we would like to develop an international collection of the historical and heritage smells of objects, but we also want to use the smell in the museum, the displays, to engaging the audience in a multi-sensory way. So not only watching the objects, not only listening to the audio guide or the, let me say, some history of objects that can be played from some device near to the object, but also sometimes you can touch the objects. Nowadays it's very popular that museums are preparing the copy that you can touch. It's for children mostly. And now we have the fourth element, so we can use our nose to sniff the objects. And coming back to this picture, it's very important for the blind people because they cannot see objects. They have other senses much more intensive, so the sniffing is important for them. And I call it sometimes the sightseeing in 4K, so we are using all of your senses that you can use during the sightseeing of the museum. What are research questions? Of course, we want to know if it is possible to characterize the smell of the objects, the exceptional importance objects, which are coming from the collections in Krakow and in Ljubljana. We want to know if this smell can be described and cataloged for the purpose of conservation of smells. This is the developing Odoteca archive. And we want to know how this olfactometry information can be precisely presented to the audience, but also we want to know from the audience what additional experience they are feeling during the sightseeing the exhibition when the smell of the object is around it. And how we want to do it? We want to use the chemical methods to characterize the smell of the objects and to reconstruct it, of course. We will develop the historical narrative which help us describe the importance of the smells, but this component has to include also the information about the historical smell of the objects, but also about any treatment on everything that could in past influence the smell, for example, conservation treatment. And of course, we have to decide how to store this information, in what way that it will transpass the barrier of time and the barrier of culture. Of course, store in the archive of smell of historical objects, so in Odoteca. Of course, we will use our tools, which were already nicely shown by Cecilia and Emma. So we can use spimy fiber, we can use sorption tubes, or teglar bags and other enclosures, and we literally will sniff these objects and collect their smell on one of the devices. As the result of analysis, we will of course obtain chromatograms in which each peak is the component of the mixture, which is smell of the object itself. Additionally, as Cecilia was mentioning, we can do the olfactogram, so we can name the smell of each component in this mixture. Actually, this is the smell of walnut board of Lady with Ermine, so it's measurement made from the back side of it. Of course, we will recreate these smells, as it was mentioned, by using only safe compounds. They have to be safe for visitors, but also safe for objects itself. So it will be tested by using, among other, audit tests. Then we will spray, or we'll think in what way this smells, reconstructed smells around close to the object, but also we will give this historical olfactometry narrative about the object near to it. And we will also carry out the structured interview with the visitors, and we ask them to assess how this extra smell of the objects is influencing their feeling about the objects and in this display itself. Of course, we want to be sure that the Lady with Ermine smell like the original painting, so we will test authenticity by the olfactometry measurements, but also using the panel of experts. So, as we can summarize, the Odoteca will stand on three very strong legs. First of all, we will have data from chemical analysis which give a recipe, so it will have information what compounds mix in what concentration to recreate the smell of the object. We'll have also data from sensory analysis. It will allow us to assess the sensory quality of reconstructed smells. And we'll have also third leg, so olfactometry historic significant. This is this historical narratives exploring the significance of olfactometry of examined object. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Tomasz. Do we have questions? I can see a very eager hand in the front. Cecilia?
Thank you, Mattia. Thank you, Tomasz. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you're going to test if you have been successful with the reconstruction in terms of presenting the smell with and without the source. So are you going to ask people to smell the original object and then smell the reconstruction?
That's what we are bothering now. We want to buy the teglar bags that will allow us to take also the sample for the panel of experts to sniff it. So we'll just suck the sample into the teglar bags, and then, they have the valves, so you can empty them at the nose and you can assess if it is the same smell.
I understand that, thank you. But will it be with the visual cue and without the visual cue? So will they be able to see the original object?
Yes.
And for the reconstruction, will they have a visual cue?
Yes.
So you'll present a replica of an object with the reconstructed smell?
Once more, I panted myself.
I'm coming from the fact that we know that visual information or words mediate the way we interpret smells. So depending on what you present with the smell itself, you are modifying that response, right? If I tell you this smell is unpleasant before you smell it, you might find it unpleasant because I told you so, right? So I'm asking, when you present the original source, the object with a smell, and then the reconstructed smell, how will you control that variable of the visual stimuli in both experiments to make sure that it's not the main influence on the interpretation?
They already have knowledge, and they will tell that it's authentically. I think that we have to think how to solve this problem between us in our teams, because we are also collaborating with our panel expert at our university. They are really helpful in this, so you are right that we have to think about the solution in this case.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? If not, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, dear audience here as well as online. I hope you enjoyed this workshop. We are embarking on this new project called Odoteca. You've seen how cross-disciplinary it is, and we've learned a lot from the discussions today, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot more in the next 3 years to come. Thank you to all the presenters, and thank you again to the online audience and our collaborators in the National Museum with whom we pulled together the program for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.